The wind tried to peel Clyde Lockhart off the tower like old paint, and still he climbed. Rain came sideways, needling through the gaps in his leather jerkin, and every few heartbeats the sky above Ironfang Pass tore open with lightning that turned the world the color of bone. Skytooth Watch had stood empty for 100 years, a broken finger of gray stone jabbing up from the mountainside, and half its inner stair had crumbled to rubble long before Clyde was born. He climbed anyway, hand over hand along the exposed ladder of old support beams bolted to the outer wall, because an hour ago Morag Wildheart had looked at him across a dying campfire, green eyes bright with challenge, and said the words that no man with any pride left in him could walk away from. "You would not last past the first landing," she had said, tusks catching the firelight when she smiled. "Humans are built for warm halls and soft beds, not for storms." Is that a dare or an insult? He had asked. "Both," she had said. "Climb the tower, Clyde Lockhart, and prove me wrong, or stay by the fire where it is safe, and I will think of you exactly as I do now." He had not asked how she thought of him now. He had simply stood, checked the knots on his boots, and walked out into the storm. The memory carried him another 10 feet up the tower, past a socket where a torch bracket had once hung, black iron gone to rust and lace. Below him, the caravan's fires were smothered gray smears in the rain, tiny and far away. Above him, the tower's broken crown waited, jagged against the lightning, and Clyde told himself that a fall from this height would kill him quickly, which was some comfort in its way. His fingers found a crack in the stonework slick with rain, and he hauled himself higher, boots scrabbling for purchase, thighs burning, rain running down inside his collar in a cold river. Thunder cracked so close he felt it in his teeth. For one long, terrible moment his foot slipped entirely free of the wall, and he hung by both hands from a ledge no wider than a coin, heart slamming, mouth full of the taste of copper and fear. He did not fall. He found the ledge again with his boot, breathed, and climbed on, because somewhere above him, impossibly, warmly, he could swear he heard someone laughing. He reached the shattered lip of the tower's top with his arms shaking so badly he could hardly grip the final stone, and he hauled himself over the edge into what should have been an empty, storm-lashed platform of broken flagstones open to the sky. It was not empty. Morag Wildheart stood at the center of the tower's crown with her arms crossed and rain sluicing down the green plane of her face, her dark hair plastered flat and shining, entirely unbothered by wind that had nearly killed him twice on the way up. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and oiled against the wet, laced tight up her sides and across a broad leather baldric that crossed her chest, the whole of it cut close to a frame built of hard muscle and unhurried strength, a long hunting knife at her hip and a coil of climbing rope looped over one shoulder. She looked, Clyde thought stupidly, like something the storm itself had made, and then decided to keep. "You," he said when he had enough breath to say anything at all, "climbed the outside wall faster than I could manage the ladder." "I did not climb the wall." Morag's mouth curved, wicked and delighted. "There is a goat track around the eastern face. I have scouted this pass twice before, human. I know its bones. You let me climb through a storm on a dare and then took the easy path yourself. I never said I would take the hard path." She stepped closer and lightning threw her shadow huge and sudden across the broken stones. "I only said you would not last, and yet here you are." He was standing in front of her, chest heaving, soaked to the bone, arms trembling from the climb, and something in her voice had gone quieter than the wind, quieter than the storm, quieter than anything he had heard from her in 5 days of sharp words and sharper looks. "Here I am," he agreed. "You could have died," she said, and for the first time since he had met her there was no mockery in it at all. "You could have told me about the goat track. Then I would not have learned what I wanted to learn." "And what was that?" Morag reached out, slow enough that he could have stepped back and laid 2 fingers against the center of his chest, over his hammering heart, as if she meant to feel for herself whether the climb had been worth the terror it had cost him. Rain ran between them. Thunder rolled away over the black teeth of the mountains. "Whether you were fool enough to try," she said softly, "and brave enough to succeed. Which am I?" "Both," she said, echoing his own question back at him. And this close he could see that her eyes were not merely green but flecked through with gold, like sun through a forest canopy, and that the fierce, dangerous line of her mouth had softened into something that looked, astonishingly, like tenderness. He did not decide to kiss her. It happened the way the lightning happened, sudden and total and impossible to take back, his hand finding the wet leather at her waist, her fingers curling into the front of his shirt and pulling him the rest of the way in. And for one long, storm-drenched moment there was no wind and no rain and no 100 feet of empty air below them. Only her mouth against his, warm despite the cold, fierce despite the tenderness, and the taste of rain and rasp of her breath against his lips. Thunder cracked directly overhead, close enough to shake dust from the ancient stones, and Morag broke away first, breathing hard, eyes wide with something that looked almost like alarm at herself. "We should get down," she said, "before the mountain decides to finish what the storm started." "Agreed," Clyde said, though every part of him wanted to argue. Neither of them spoke of the kiss on the long, careful climb back down the tower, roped together now with her line, her hand closing over his wrist at every treacherous stretch as if she did not entirely trust the storm not to take him after all. But when they dropped at last onto solid ground, soaked and shaking with cold and adrenaline both, she looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something measuring and something wanting, both at once, and he understood that whatever had been between them before that climb, it had changed forever at the top of that tower. It had started 5 days earlier, at a trading post called Millhaven at the foot of Ironfang Pass, where Clyde Lockhart had been leaning against a hitching post counting the coin a merchant named Bellwether owed him for the last job, when a shadow had fallen over him large enough to belong to a barn door. "You are the guard," the shadow had said. "The one Bellwether hired to see his wagons up to Cairnhold." Clyde had looked up into the face of an orc woman a full head taller than himself, broad through the shoulder, dressed in dark travel leathers laced tight from throat to hip, a short sword and hunting knife at her belt and an ease in the way she stood that spoke of long practice with both. She had looked at him the way a butcher looks at a thin cut of meat, and he had felt, for the first time in a long while, distinctly unimpressive. "I am," he had said, "Clyde Lockhart, and you would be Morag Wildheart. Bellwether has also hired me for the same wagons." He did not mention a second guard. "Perhaps he did not think you needed to know until it mattered." She had smiled, not kindly. "Or perhaps he thinks one sword is not enough for Ironfang Pass, and wanted a real one along, in case yours proves ornamental." It had gone on like that for the better part of an hour, and for the 5 days after, up switchback trails and through pine-dark valleys, the two of them trading barbs over campfires and across the backs of nervous mules, each finding fault with the other's methods, each refusing to yield an inch of ground, guard to guard, pride to pride. Clyde had grown up on the eastern border farms, had taken up guard work after his family's steading burned in a raid he had been too young and too far away to stop, and he had learned in the years since to trust few people and to prove himself to the rest through steady, quiet competence rather than boasting. Morag had left her clan 2 winters past, had turned her back on kin and inheritance both rather than accept a marriage arranged to seal a peace between rival war bands, and had spent those 2 winters earning a reputation fierce enough that raiders along 3 separate trade roads knew her name and steered wide of any caravan she guarded. Neither of them in 5 days had admitted that the other's competence was not the thing that unsettled them. It was Dross, one of the other hired guards, a thick-necked man with a scar through one eyebrow, who had first put voice to the ugliness that simmered under the caravan's daily grind. On the 3rd night, over stew, he had said loudly enough for the whole camp to hear that he did not see why Bellwether paid coin to a green-skinned savage when there were honest men who needed the work, and that he for one did not sleep easy with an orc's knife within reach of his throat. Clyde had set down his bowl very carefully and said, in a voice gone flat and cold, that Morag Wildheart had killed 3 raiders in an ambush on the cliff road the previous winter while Dross, so far as anyone in this camp had heard, had never killed anything more dangerous than a bottle of cheap wine, and that if Dross wanted to keep flapping his mouth about savages, he could do it walking back to Millhaven alone. Dross had not brought it up again, not with words, though the look he gave Morag afterward had lost none of its poison. Morag herself had said nothing at all in her own defense, only watched Clyde across the fire afterward with an expression he could not read, something between surprise and calculation, as if she were recounting a debt she had not expected to be owed. "You did not need to do that," she had told him later when the others had gone to their bedrolls. "I know," Clyde had said. "I wanted to. Most humans on this road would have let him talk. I am not most humans." "No," she had agreed, studying him in the firelight with an intensity that had made his skin prickle. "You are not." That had been 2 nights before the storm caught them at Skytooth Watch, before the dare, before the climb, before the kiss that neither of them could take back. And in the days that followed the tower, as the caravan wound higher into Ironfang past toward the monastery market of Cairnhold at its head, the rivalry between them did not end so much as it changed shape, sharpened into something that crackled every time their hands brushed passing a waterskin, every time she leaned close over a map to argue about the safest fork in the trail, every time he caught her watching him from across the camp with an expression that was no longer quite so hostile. 3 days after the tower, on a narrow shelf of trail with a drop on one side steep enough to make the mules balk, Morag had reached out without warning and hauled Clyde back from the edge by the collar of his jerkin when his footing slipped on loose scree, and had then, in the space of a single held breath with his back against her chest and her arm locked hard across him, kissed the side of his throat once, fierce and quick, before shoving him upright and striding ahead as if nothing at all had happened. "You could simply say thank you," Clyde had called after her, voice not quite steady. "I could," Morag had agreed, not turning around, "but where is the fun in that?" Cairnhold announced itself first as a smell, wood smoke, and incense drifting down through the pines, and then as a sound, distant bells ringing the hour from somewhere above the tree line, and finally, as the caravan crested the last switchback of Ironfang Pass, as a sight that made even Clyde, who had seen a fair share of the world, stop and stare. The monastery market sat astride the pass like a cork in a bottle, the only easy crossing for 100 miles in either direction, and it had grown over centuries into something neither purely temple nor purely town. Gray stone walls climbed the shoulders of the mountain on either side, pierced through with terraces where monks in undyed wool tended herb gardens between prayer bells, and below those walls sprawled a market of timber stalls and canvas awnings, where human traders from the lowlands stood shoulder to shoulder with orc traders from the high clans, weighing furs and salt and iron against bolts of woven cloth, all of it watched over by robed monks whose only weapons were the staffs they leaned on and the old truce they enforced with nothing but their word. "The Grey Order," Morag said, coming to stand beside Clyde at the rim of the pass, "have kept this ground neutral since before either of our peoples had a name for the other that was not also a curse. Humans and orcs trade here without blood, because Brother Aldous and his monks will turn away anyone of either kind who breaks the peace. You have been here before. Twice. Once as a girl with my father before I understood what it cost him to walk these streets and be looked at the way some of them look at us still." Her jaw tightened. "It has grown more crowded with lowland traders since, more prosperous, also more suspicious. They made the last descent into Cairnhold with the wagons in the golden slant of late afternoon, and Clyde felt the suspicion Morag had spoken of almost at once, a ripple of narrowed eyes and drawn-back children as she walked the market lane at his side, tall and unmistakably orc among a crowd that was mostly, in this stretch of the market, human. He fell into step half a pace closer to her without deciding to. A small thing, but he saw her notice it, saw something in her shoulders ease very slightly at having him there. Bellwether paid out the last of their coin at the caravanserai near the monastery's outer gate, thanked them both with the distracted warmth of a man already thinking of his next contract, and left Clyde and Morag standing together in the cooling evening with no employer, no wagons to guard, and no reason at all to keep walking the same road. Neither of them suggested parting. They took rooms instead at the same modest inn tucked against the market wall, a place called the Cairn Bell, run by a stout widow named Fairies who did not so much as blink at an orc woman renting a room beside a human man. And over the days that followed they found themselves, without ever quite discussing it, taking meals together, walking the market together. And once, on a night when the monastery bells rang some feast Clyde did not know the name of, standing together on the terrace above the inn watching lantern lights spill gold across the mountainside, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Stay here with me a while," Morag said, into the quiet. "Bellwether will need guards again before the season turns. There is coin to be made watching this pass, and I find I do not mind your company, Clyde Lockhart, though it pains me to admit it. That is the closest thing to a kind word I have heard from you yet. Do not grow used to it." But she was smiling when she said it, and when he turned his head to look at her, she did not look away, and the kiss that followed was slower than the one atop the storm-lashed tower, unhurried, deliberate, her hand coming up to cradle the side of his jaw with a gentleness that startled him from a woman who could break a man's arm without much effort at all. It was 4 days later, in the crowded lane outside the weaver's stalls, that the ugliness Morag had warned him of finally found its voice in the open. A merchant's wife, richly dressed in lowland fashion, had been haggling loudly over a bolt of blue cloth when her small son darted too near Morag's legs chasing a loose chicken, and Morag, quick as thought, had caught the boy by the back of his tunic before he could stumble into the path of a passing cart. She had set him gently back on his feet. The boy had laughed, his mother had screamed, "Get your hands off him!" The woman shrieked, snatching her son away as if Morag's touch had been a burning brand. "Someone help, the orc has hold of my son!" The market lane froze. Heads turned. A knot of men near the weaver's stall, none of them Clyde recognized, began to close in with the particular ugly purpose of a crowd that has decided, all at once, that it wants blood, and one of them had a hand already on the hilt of a belt knife. "She saved him from the cart," Clyde said, stepping into the space between Morag and the gathering men before he had entirely decided to do it, his voice pitched to carry, hands spread open and empty but planted, immovable. "I saw the whole of it. The boy ran loose, she caught him and set him down safe, and that is the whole of what happened here." "You would say that," one of the men spat, riding along with her like her own tame dog. "I would say it because it is true," Clyde said, and did not move, though his heart was hammering hard enough that he could feel it in his throat, "and because if any one of you takes another step toward her, you will have to go through me first, and I promise you that will take longer and hurt more than you expect." For a long, taut moment nobody moved at all. Then a gray-robed figure pushed through the crowd, an elderly monk with a face seemed like old leather and eyes that missed nothing, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for a stone. "Brother Aldous," Morag said, low. "I saw it from the terrace," the old monk said, mild as milk, though there was iron underneath it. "The boy is unharmed because of this woman's quickness, and any man here who wishes to argue otherwise may argue it with me, and with the truce this ground was built on, which I have kept for 40 years and mean to keep a good while longer." He looked round at the knot of men until, one by one, they found reasons to be elsewhere. Then he turned to Morag and inclined his head with real courtesy. "My thanks for the boy." The crowd broke apart muttering, and the danger passed as suddenly as it had risen, but Morag's hands, Clyde saw, were shaking very slightly at her sides, not with fear but with a controlled banked fury that had clearly had long practice at being controlled. "You did not have to stand in front of me," she said to him, once they had walked clear of the lane, her voice rougher than usual. "I know," Clyde said again, echoing the words from the campfire weeks before. "I wanted to. They would have hurt you. They would have tried." Morag stopped walking, right there in the shadow of the monastery wall, and turned to face him fully, and there was something raw and unguarded in her expression that he had not seen from her before, not even at the top of the tower. "I have spent 2 years," she said, "learning not to need anyone to stand in front of me. I am not certain I know what to do with a man who does it anyway." "You do not have to do anything with it," Clyde said. "I am not asking to be thanked." "Good," Morag said, "because I was not about to thank you." And then she kissed him, hard and sudden, right there against the monastery wall in full view of the market, one hand fisted in the front of his shirt, and there was nothing careful or slow about it at all, only a fierce, hungry claiming that left him breathless and left no one who witnessed it in any doubt at all about where Morag Wildheart's loyalties now lay. It was 3 weeks after that, with the first bite of autumn cooling the mountain air and the market at Cairnhold thick with the season's last great trading push, that Morag rode out alone at first light to scout a delayed shipment of ore that should have reached the pass 2 days prior, and did not return by nightfall. Clyde knew something was wrong before anyone told him. He had learned the rhythm of her by then, the way she moved, the hours she kept, and when the sun dropped behind the western peaks and her horse had not come trotting back through the market gate, a cold weight settled into his stomach that had nothing to do with the evening chill. It was near midnight when a boy from the lower gate came running for Brother Aldous, with word that a rider had left something pinned to the gatepost with a raider's knife, and fled back into the dark before anyone could catch him. Clyde was at the old monk's side within minutes, and read the message over his shoulder by lantern light with a rising, roaring dread. The message was crude, scratched in charcoal on stretched hide, but the meaning was plain enough. Morag Wildheart, it said, was held by the Ashfang Raiders, an exiled band of outlaw orcs who preyed on caravans up and down the pass and beyond its reach, and she would be returned in 3 days' time, at dusk, at the old stone bridge below Cairnhold's lower gate, in exchange for the warden's seal, the ancient carved relic that had sat in the monastery's keeping since before living memory. The very symbol and guarantee of the truce that let human and orc trade side by side on this mountain without bloodshed. If the seal was not delivered, the message finished, she would be returned regardless, in pieces. "Gruck Ashfang," Brother Aldous said grimly, when Clyde demanded to know who would dare such a thing. "He leads what remains of a warband exiled from 3 clans for raiding their own kin as readily as ours. Morag killed his brother 2 winters past. In a rage she turned back before it reached a caravan of children bound for the lowland orphan houses. He has wanted vengeance on her ever since, and the excuse of the seal is only that, an excuse, though the demand is no less real for it." "Then give him the seal," Clyde said, "and get her back. It is not so simple, young man." Brother Aldous's weathered face was heavy with a grief that told Clyde the old monk had already turned this over 100 times in the hours since the message came. "The seal is not merely an old carving. It is the proof both human traders and orc traders accept that Cairnhold answers to no crown and no clan, that this ground is neutral and always will be. Without it, the peace here does not simply weaken. It ends. Human lords to the east and orc chieftains to the west have wanted this pass under their own banner for 100 years. The moment word spreads that the seal is gone, both will move to claim it, and the market, the truce, everything built on this mountain across 3 generations, will be trampled between them within a season. Every trader here, human and orc both, will lose their livelihood. Some will lose far more than that. So the council would let her die to keep a symbol. The council," Brother Aldous said heavily, "has not yet decided what it will do. And I fear whatever it decides, it will be too slow and too cold to satisfy either your heart or hers." Clyde walked out of that meeting with his hands shaking, and his mind already made up, because he had watched the council of merchants and monks argue for 2 more days over parchment and precedent, while Morag Wildheart sat somewhere in the dark hills bound and waiting, and he understood with total clarity that he could not stand by while old men weighed her life against a piece of carved stone. He went instead, on the evening of the second day, to the raider camp's messenger, a lean, scarred orc who had come under a truce flag to hear the council's answer, and made an offer of his own before the council could make theirs. "Tell Gruck Ashfang," Clyde said, standing very straight though his heart hammered fit to break his ribs, "that the seal does not leave this mountain. But if he wants a killing to settle his brother's death, he can have one in single combat at the stone bridge at the appointed hour. Morag Wildheart's champion against his own chosen fighter. If his man wins, Gruck gets his vengeance and more besides, and Morag stays with him. If mine wins, she walks free, and the debt between Ashfang and Wildheart is closed forever, blood for blood, and he troubles this pass no more." "And who?" the messenger asked, tusks bared in something between amusement and contempt, "is her champion?" "I am," Clyde said. The messenger laughed, short and ugly, and looked Clyde up and down as if measuring a lamb for slaughter, but he carried the offer back into the hills regardless, and returned before dawn with Gruck Ashfang's answer scrawled in the same crude charcoal, accepted with relish, and a warning that Gruck's chosen fighter had never once lost a duel to a human, and did not intend to begin with this one. Brother Aldous tried to talk him out of it. Bellwether, who had returned to Cairnhold with fresh wagons and heard the whole tale within an hour of arriving, tried to talk him out of it. Even Dross, of all people, cornered him outside the cairn bell to tell him bluntly that he was a fool to throw his life away for an orc woman, and that no coin in the world was worth what he was about to attempt. "This is not about coin," Clyde told him, and meant it with everything he had. He spent the 2 days before the duel in the small yard behind the inn, working through the forms Morag herself had drilled into him without either of them quite calling it teaching, the low guard she favored, the way she turned a bigger opponent's strength back against them rather than meeting it head-on. He barely slept. He barely ate. He thought every waking hour of the top of a storm-lashed tower and the way she had looked at him there, wet through and fierce and, for one unguarded moment, entirely without armor around her heart, and he told himself that whatever happened at the stone bridge, he would not let that moment be the last thing between them. Word of the duel spread through Cairnhold like fire through dry grass. By the appointed dusk, 3 days after Morag had ridden out and not returned, the market square and the lane leading down to the lower gate were packed shoulder to shoulder with humans and orcs both, merchants who had put aside their scales, monks who had left their prayers unfinished, children lifted onto shoulders for a better view, all of them drawn by the same impossible, electric knowledge that a human guard was about to fight an orc raider champion at the old stone bridge. For the life of an orc woman the whole mountain had, in one way or another, come to know. Brother Aldous walked out onto the bridge himself as the sun sank red and huge behind the western peaks, staff in hand, to stand as witness and judge in the name of the truce that had governed this ground for 100 years. Gruck Ashfang came down from the hills with a dozen of his raiders at his back, a towering, scarred orc with a broken tusk and eyes like chips of flint, and beside him, bound at the wrists but walking with her chin high and her spine unbowed, came Morag Wildheart. She looked thinner than Clyde remembered, bruised along one cheekbone, her travel leathers torn at the shoulder, but the moment her eyes found him standing at the near end of the bridge, sword in hand, something in her face broke open with a shock so raw it was visible even from a distance, disbelief and fury, and a terror that had nothing to do with her own danger. "No," she said, loud enough to carry across the water, straining hard enough against the rope at her wrists that one of the raiders shoved her still. "Clyde, no, you fool, you utter fool, this is not your fight. It became my fight," Clyde called back, "the moment they took you." Gruck Ashfang's champion stepped onto the bridge from the raider's side, a mountain of an orc named Karn, scarred across both forearms, wielding a two-handed axe that looked heavy enough to fell a tree in a single stroke. And the crowd on both banks went utterly silent, human and orc alike holding their breath as one, waiting to see whether the strange, desperate wager a caravan guard had made for a woman not his own blood would end in triumph or in slaughter. The duel began at Brother Aldous' raised staff, and it was, from its first exchange, brutal. Karn came in with the axe swinging in a wide, powerful arc that would have taken Clyde's head from his shoulders, had he not thrown himself flat against the old stone parapet, the blade shrieking off rock inches above him. He rolled up, and inside the axes reached the way Morag had shown him, close enough that the bigger weapon's advantage turned to a liability, and drove the pommel of his sword hard into Karn's ribs, earning a grunt of pain and a backhand blow from Karn's offhand that sent him staggering into the bridge rail with his ears ringing. Blood ran hot down the side of Clyde's face from a cut he did not remember taking. The crowd roared, some of it for him, a startling amount of it for him. Humans and orcs both crying out at the courage of the thing even as they braced to watch him die for it. He caught Karn's next swing on the flat of his blade at an angle Morag had drilled into him a dozen times over a dozen fire-lit evenings, redirecting the terrible weight of the axe past his shoulder rather than trying to meet it, and used the half-second that bought him to drive a hard, ugly kick into the side of Karn's knee. Karn roared and staggered, and in that stagger, Clyde saw his opening and did not take it fast enough. The axe came around low and fast, and only a desperate half-turn kept it from opening his belly instead of tearing a long, burning line across his forearm, and the sword spun from his numbed fingers to clatter across the bridge stones. Disarmed, bleeding, with Karn advancing for the killing blow, Clyde heard, over the roar of the crowd, one voice cut through everything else. "Clyde, the rope, use the rope under the left rail." It was Morag, straining against her captors, and Clyde did not stop to ask how she knew, only threw himself sideways and down, hands closing on the old, half-rotted length of rope she had somehow spotted lashed beneath the bridge rail, leftover rigging from some long-forgotten repair, and hauled it up and around Karn's ankle as the raider champion lunged past him with the axe already falling. Karn's foot caught. His huge weight, already committed to the swing, pitched forward off balance, and the axe buried itself in the bridge stones instead of in Clyde's skull, and before Karn could wrench it free, Clyde was on him, driving his fist and then his knee and then, at last, his recovered sword hilt into every opening the bigger orc stumble had given him, until Karn went down hard onto the ancient stones and did not rise, the fight beaten out of him, his own axe pinned uselessly beneath his sprawled weight. Silence held the bridge for one long, ringing heartbeat. Then it broke into chaos, humans and orcs alike shouting, and Brother Aldous' staff cracked down against stone to call the duel ended, and the debt, by the terms both sides had sworn, closed. Gruck Ashfang's face was a mask of fury and disbelief, but the truce oath had been sworn before witnesses of both peoples, and even a raider chieftain could not break it in front of 100 watching traders without inviting every clan and every crown on the mountain down upon his head. He spat at Clyde's feet, cut the rope binding Morag's wrists with one vicious stroke of his knife, and stalked back up into the darkening hills with his men and his beaten champion, and did not trouble Ironfang pass again. Morag crossed the bridge at a run the moment her hands were free, and Clyde, exhausted and bleeding and barely able to stand, had just enough strength left to catch her when she reached him. "You utter complete fool," she said against his shoulder, her voice cracking on the words, her arms locked around him hard enough to bruise. "You could have died. You very nearly did die. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking," Clyde said into her hair, "that I would rather die trying to bring you home than live safe without you." Morag pulled back just far enough to look at him, and there were tears standing in her eyes that she made no effort at all to hide. An orc warrior feared up and down the pass, weeping openly in front of 100 witnesses without a shred of shame. "No one has ever fought for me before," she said. "Not like that, not with everything they had." "Get used to it," Clyde said. I am not going anywhere." She kissed him then in front of the whole crowd, in front of Bellwether and Dross and Brother Aldous, and 100 merchants and monks and orc traders who had come to watch a duel and stayed to witness something else entirely. And it was not careful and it was not slow. It was fierce and full and unashamed. And when at last she drew back, she pressed her forehead to his, breathing hard, and said, low enough that only he could hear it, "In my clan," she said, "when a warrior wishes to claim another before all their people, there is a mark given, a binding of choice, freely made, freely witnessed. I have not given it to anyone. I did not think I ever would. Do you want to give it now?" "I want," Morag said, "to give it to you if you will have it, knowing what it means among my people, that I choose you, that I will stand at your side against anything this mountain or any other throws at us, and that I expect the same in return for as long as we both draw breath." "You already have that from me," Clyde said. "You have had it since the top of a tower in a storm." Morag laughed, a wet, startled sound, and drew her hunting knife, and before the assembled crowd, monk and merchant, human and orc alike, she drew a small, careful line along the meat of her own palm. And then, when Clyde offered his hand without hesitation, along his as well, and pressed the two wounds together, blood to blood, in a gesture that needed no translation for anyone watching to understand exactly what it meant. "Mine," she said, fierce and clear enough to carry to every corner of that hushed crowd, "by my own choosing and no one's else." "Yours," Clyde agreed, and the crowd, after one stunned breath, began to cheer. Human voices and orc voices tangled together in a sound Cairnhold's old stones had perhaps never heard in quite that combination before. That night in the small room above the cairn bell, with the mountain wind sighing soft against the shutters instead of screaming, Morag tended the long cut on Clyde's forearm with a gentleness that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him, her hands, capable of breaking bone, moving with careful, unhurried tenderness as she bound clean linen over the wound. "I was so afraid," she admitted quietly, not looking up from her work. "In that camp in the dark, I told myself I did not need rescuing, that I would find my own way free. And then I heard, from one of the raiders bragging, that a human guard had offered himself in single combat for my sake, and I thought my heart would tear itself apart, half with terror for you and half with something I did not have a name for until I saw you standing on that bridge. What do you have a name for it now?" Morag looked up at last, green eyes gold-flecked and steady in the lamplight, and there was nothing guarded left in her face at all. "Love," she said simply. "I have a name for it now. I love you, Clyde Lockhart. I did not choose to. I fought it as hard as I fought you, that first week on the road, and I lost far worse to you than I ever admitted. I love you too," Clyde said, and it felt, saying it aloud at last, like setting down a weight he had not known he was carrying since long before he ever met her. "I think I have since the top of that tower, when I found you already there, and realized I would have climbed through worse storms than that one just to reach you." She kissed him then, slow and warm and unhurried. The last of the fierce urgency of the bridge softened now into something deeper, something that asked rather than claimed, and he answered it with everything he had. And the storm outside, when it came again in the small hours before dawn, found their shutters closed and their hearts, for the first time either of them could remember, entirely unguarded against each other. Word of the duel at the stone bridge spread down the pass faster than any caravan could carry it, and by the time the last golden days of autumn gave way to the first hard frost, the tale of the human guard and the orc champion he had won free had become something told over campfires from Millhaven to the lowland markets 3 weeks' ride distant. Cairnhold itself changed in ways neither Clyde nor Morag had expected. The merchant's wife, whose son Morag had once saved from a runaway cart, brought a basket of bread to their door unasked, and stood stammering an apology neither of them had demanded, but both accepted graciously. Dross, gruff and awkward, sought Clyde out one evening to admit, with visible difficulty, that he had misjudged Morag Wildheart entirely, and that he would be glad, if it were welcome, to stand guard beside either of them again. Even the council of merchants, who had argued for 2 days over an old carved stone, while a woman's life hung in the balance, voted unanimously within the week to commission a second seal, a lesser copy, to be carried publicly as a symbol of the truce from that day forward, so that no single relic would ever again hold a life hostage to its safe keeping. Brother Aldous, when the frost had properly set in and the last caravans of the season were readying to descend before the high passes closed for winter, called Clyde and Morag to the terrace above the monastery gardens, where the whole sweep of Ironfang Pass lay spread below them, silver with early snow. "Cairnhold has stood 100 years on a simple idea," the old monk said. "That peace between our peoples is worth more than the old grudges that would keep us apart. I have watched a great many caravans pass through this gate in my years, young man, young woman, and I have rarely seen that idea proven so plainly or so bravely as I saw it proven on that bridge. The council has voted to grant you both standing as sworn wardens of the pass, should you wish it, guards of Cairnhold itself rather than of any single caravan, with a home within these walls for as long as you care to keep it." Clyde looked at Morag, who was looking back at him with the particular fierce brightness in her eyes that he had first seen at the top of a storm-lashed tower, and had since learned to treasure above almost anything in the world. "We accept," Morag said, before Clyde had even opened his mouth to answer, and when he laughed and told her she might have let him speak for himself once in a while, she only arched a brow and reminded him, with the ghost of the old rivalry still warm in her voice, that she had known his answer before he did, same as she had known, from the very first evening at Millhaven, exactly what kind of man he would prove to be. They were married, if that was even the right word for a binding sealed in blood and choice rather than in any priest's blessing, on the first clear day of the following spring, on the crown of Skytooth Watch itself, the ruined tower rebuilt just enough by willing hands from the market below to hold a small gathering safely, with Brother Aldous presiding over vows that borrowed as much from orc custom as from human, and with Bellwether and Dross and half of Cairnhold's traders, human and orc alike, crowded onto the mountainside below to watch and cheer. Standing at the tower's broken crown with Morag's hand locked in his, and the whole silver sweep of Ironfang Pass spread beneath them, the same wind that had once nearly torn him from the wall now gentle and warm with the turning season, Clyde thought of the storm that had brought them here, of a dare thrown across a dying campfire, of the terror of the climb and the impossible, wonderful shock of finding her already waiting at the top. "I would climb it again," he told her, 100 times over in 100 worse storms, if it meant reaching you at the end of it. "You will not have to," Morag said, drawing him close, her forehead resting against his the way it had on the bridge, the whole of Cairnhold and its long, hard-won peace spread out golden and living below them. "I have no intention of ever letting you climb toward me alone again, Clyde Lockhart. Wherever you go from this day forward, I will already be there beside you, storm or no storm, and you will never have to wonder, not once more in your life, whether you are wanted." "I already know I am," he said, and kissed her there atop the tower where it had all begun, with the whole mountain watching and the whole mountain at long last glad. The wind that carried their vows down into the pass that day was gentle, and the bells of Cairnhold rang long into the afternoon, and when the two of them climbed down together at last, hand in hand, to walk into the market square as sworn wardens of the pass, husband and wife, human and orc, equal in courage and equal in love, no one in that crowd of traders and monks and townsfolk raised a single voice against them. They had earned their home on that mountain the hardest way there was, through storm and blade and blood freely given, and they meant, both of them, to keep it, and each other, for every season the mountain had left to give them.